All right, so you're here with us on the deep dive because let's be honest, you want to like get right to the good stuff right. You want to actually understand complex topics, but you don't necessarily have time to like read a whole bunch of books or anything, right?
Totally.
Well, today we are taking a deep dive into the work of Bob Camblin, and we've got some really fascinating material to work with.
Yeah.
We've got like a collection of his own quotes, just kind of his own thoughts and musings. We've got a pretty detailed biography of his life, and then also some interpretations of his artwork,
Yeah.
particularly this really interesting watercolor called What Have You Done to Mother Nature?
Right.
Yeah.
And so Bob Camblin, he was born in Oklahoma in 1928, had a really interesting artistic journey.
Oh, yeah.
He honed his skills at the Kansas City Art Institute, even spent time in Italy on a Fulbright scholarship.
Wow.
Which, really cool. But what's kind of intriguing is that despite all this, despite this really solid artistic foundation and, the high regard from his peers, his work isn't actually widely seen, which kind of adds to the mystique surrounding him.
Definitely adds to the mystique. Okay,
Yeah.
so our mission today in this deep dive is to basically use all of this rich material. Right?
Yes.
We've got these personal reflections. We've got the story of his life,
Yeah.
His artistic path, and then those insights into that powerful watercolor. And we're going to use all of that to try to give you a really clear understanding of, Camblin's unique perspective on art and life.
Exactly.
This is your like shortcut to understanding this really fascinating artist.
That's right.
All right, so let's just jump right in and let's start with exploring Camblin's worldview, kind of as it's revealed through his quotes.
Okay.
He had some really thought-provoking ideas, sometimes seemingly, contrasting ideas.
Yeah, and what you see right away is this really interesting pairing. On the one hand, he talks about the importance of common sense. He calls it common sense in quotes.
Right.
And the perfectly average understanding of the universe. But then at the same time, he seems to want to see like the intersection of science and magic. He wants to see them meet in this bright gray. So it suggests someone who really valued a grounded perspective on things, but also had this like real openness to wonder and to blurring the lines a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great point. He really seemed to embrace that tension almost, right? Like that tension fuels a lot of his ideas, and he placed a huge emphasis on intuition. In fact, he even said like the sixth sense is to be without a doubt.
Wow.
Which is a very like assertive statement.
It is.
And then there's this other really strong thread running through his words, which is this this idea of self-honesty. He said, "I cannot tell a lie to myself for very long," which really feels like it was fundamental not only to his art, but just to like his way of moving to the world.
Yeah, definitely. And if we think about how that emphasis on internal truth and intuition might have played out, later in his life,
Yeah.
it could really connect to his interest in Zen philosophy.
Right.
Which we know is all about like direct experience and insight, over just kind of intellectual reasoning.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And you see that also in this beautiful quote that he has, find something in nature that completes you and then surrender.
Wow. Yeah.
It speaks to this like really profound connection he had with the natural world.
Right.
It's like finding a sense of both like stability and transcendence.
Yeah, it's interesting too how his views on art itself really seem to evolve over time. He starts with a more traditional idea of art for art's sake,
Right.
but then he moves to something much more personal and even kind of like urgent, it seems like.
Yeah.
He said, art for life's sake, or art for my sake, or art for survival's sake. So I'm wondering, like, could that art for my sake part suggest that his creative process was really personal, even like therapeutic for him?
That's a really insightful observation, I think, given what we know about his later life and how he became somewhat of a recluse. It's definitely plausible that his art was more than just a philosophical pursuit, but also this way of processing and engaging with the world, a means of personal sustenance.
Yeah, totally. And then there's this other really interesting idea that he presents about thinking and acting.
Yeah.
He said, when you think, don't act. When you act, don't think. And he also talks about like stepping off the train of thought.
Yeah.
It seems like he's really advocating for being present in the moment. Whether you're like deep in thought or you're actually, creating something.
Right.
So what do you think the benefit is of kind of separating those two things?
Well, I think what's so fascinating there is the implication that, sometimes if you overthink things, you actually might get in the way of taking action.
Oh, that's interesting.
And on the flip side, sometimes when you just act, you can kind of bypass the limitations of your conscious mind, your analytical mind.
Right.
So stepping off that train of thought might be a way to tap into a more intuitive state, a less inhibited state, which he clearly valued.
Yeah, and think about like if you've ever been trying to solve a problem and you just like can't figure it out, and then you step away from it.
Right.
And then all of a sudden the answer comes to you. And throughout all of his quotes, we see this like really deep connection to nature. He talks about trees, he talks about light, he talks about the cosmos, and he even directly addresses like Mother Nature in some of his quotes about his art.
Yeah.
So it seems like he almost saw himself having this dialogue with nature.
Yeah, it suggests a relationship that goes beyond just, being inspired by nature. It's more like he sees nature as this active participant, almost like a collaborator or even a judge of his creative work. It suggests a really deep respect for nature and maybe even a sense of responsibility towards it.
Definitely. And, he also has some really interesting ideas about arguments and communication. He said, if you argue or if you agree, you may learn, but you do not communicate.
That's really interesting, especially today.
Oh, yeah.
Where we have so many polarized discussions and debates going on.
Exactly.
I think what he's getting at there is this difference between, intellectual engagement, like having a back and forth or even finding some common ground versus truly understanding something.
Right.
Like for Camblin, it seems like real communication required more than that. Maybe empathy, a willingness to really see the other person's perspective instead of just trying to prove your own point.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also presents this idea of like revolution versus evolution as ways to bring about change.
Okay.
And he thinks that evolution is what leads to understanding.
Interesting.
So it seems like he favored this idea of gradual growth and comprehension over, sudden upheaval or like, revolution.
Right. And that aligns with his overall emphasis on process. And being very aware, revolution can definitely bring about immediate change. But evolution allows for a more gradual and thorough integration of those changes and a deeper understanding of them. Okay. It's about building knowledge and insight over time.
Now, it's interesting because later in his notes, we find these like really concise observations that he wrote in haiku form.
Oh, wow.
And these haikus are often, reflecting on nature or fleeting moments. It's like his thinking kind of distilled down to these really precise, images. What do you think prompted that shift?
I think that move towards haiku shows his desire to really capture like the very essence of something, with as few words as possible, which is very much in line with a Zen approach to observation and expression.
Right.
It's about finding that deep meaning in simple and fleeting things.
And his ideas about art continue to evolve as well. And he even starts to touch upon things like participatory art and the role of belief.
Okay.
He even said, if I believe it's art, then it is.
Wow.
It was like a very bold statement
It is.
about the power of perception and intention, right? How do you think that challenges like traditional definitions of art?
I think it really does. Those more traditional definitions often focus on the skill of the artist or like, the aesthetic qualities of the work.
Yeah.
But Camblin is saying that it's really up to the creator. It's about their intention, their belief in the work.
That's so interesting.
And then you bring in participatory art, which further breaks down that barrier between the artist and the audience.
Right.
And it actually makes the viewer an active part of the artistic experience. So it really shifts things.
Yeah, for sure. And then he also introduces these concepts of resist and submit and the figure 4 as metaphors for how to navigate life's challenges.
Okay.
They almost sound like strategic approaches to dealing with complexity.
Yeah, they do.
How do you think we can kind of interpret those in a practical way?
Well, resist and submit, I think, suggests that you need to find a balance, between standing your ground and knowing when to yield, knowing when to push back and when to just let go.
That's right. And figure 4 with its kind of cyclical nature, and that potential for escape.
Yeah.
It sounds like a model for problem solving.
Okay.
Like sometimes you have to approach a problem from different angles, maybe try multiple times to find a way through.
Yeah, and he talks about learning and creativity and the dangers of cynicism. And he has this really sharp observation about it. He says cynicism is a type of creativity gone destructive and ego-oriented. So I think what he's getting at is that both healthy creativity and cynicism come from this place of imagination, right?
Yeah.
But true creativity is outward facing.
Mm.
It's about exploring possibilities.
Right.
Whereas cynicism is kind of directed inwards and it becomes limiting.
Mm.
It's like that creative impulse gets twisted by negativity and self-centeredness.
Interesting.
He also talks about finding his mystic switch
Okay.
and how important it is to truly see instead of just look.
Right.
Which reminds me of what he said earlier about intuition and deeper perception.
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by that mystic switch? It sounds like a moment of, profound insight or like a visceral connection. That shift from passively observing something to actively incrugisering and like really engaging with it.
Yeah.
And that distinction between looking and seeing, I think that's really key here.
Right.
It's about going beyond the surface and getting to the essence of something.
Okay, so he even suggests at one point that words can sometimes obscure the actual experience of art.
Oh, wow.
Which is interesting coming from somebody who clearly articulated a lot of his ideas in writing.
Right.
What do you think the implication of that is, for us as we engage with art?
Well, I think it points to the limits of language, when it comes to fully capturing the feeling of a visual or experiential thing.
Right.
For Camblin, it seems like directly experiencing art, without any explanation, allows for a much deeper and more personal connection.
Right. Okay, so then we've got his thoughts on mirrors.
Okay.
As metaphors for human connection. And then he talks about how magic can be used for power or for seeing, and he connects that to art.
Okay.
So it's like he was always exploring these deeper symbolic layers and everything.
Yeah.
What kind of insights do you think those metaphors give us about what he was trying to do with his art?
Well, the mirror analogy suggests that when we connect with other people, we see parts of ourselves reflected back at us. And his distinction between using magic for power versus using it for seeing is really interesting.
Yeah.
It shows how he understood the potential of art.
Okay.
Like, he seems to say that true art is not about control, but about, helping people to see and understand things on a deeper level.
Right. And he was obviously aware of how novelty can be fleeting in the art world.
Yeah.
And he knew that artists face this constant dilemma of, staying true to their vision.
Right.
While also trying to navigate this cultural landscape that often prioritizes what's new and exciting.
Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike.
Totally.
Yeah.
So how do you think that awareness might have affected his own choices as an artist?
I think it probably created some tension for him, this constant back and forth between his own inner voice and the pressures of the art world.
Right.
His somewhat reclusive nature. And the fact that he sometimes signed his work as anonymous could be a sign that he was choosing to prioritize his own artistic integrity over, chasing trends or fame.
Right. Okay. And he also touches briefly on the ideas of symbolism and communication. And he says that sometimes explaining something can kill it, which really resonates with what he said earlier about words and how sometimes they can get in the way of experiencing art.
Right.
So what's the main message there for someone who's like looking at a piece of art?
I think it reinforces the idea that some experiences, especially those that are really deeply felt or intuitively understood, they can lose their power or mystery if you overanalyze them or try to explain them too much. Sometimes it's better to just let the artwork speak for itself and trust your own response to it.
Okay. And then he has this other side to him, which is like this very grounded, practical side.
Yeah.
He says that there are no mistakes when you're doing your best. And he has this like playful take on the saying, pride goeth before a fall.
Okay.
He suggests that sometimes it's actually the loss of pride that leads to a downfall.
Interesting.
What do those observations tell us about his overall philosophy?
I think they show that he had this really practical wisdom, and he wasn't afraid to challenge conventional thinking.
Right.
It suggests that he accepted imperfection, that he valued effort, and that he had this nuanced understanding of human nature.
Yeah, and then there's this hologram analogy that he uses for interconnectedness.
Oh, yeah.
The idea that individual parts are arguing instead of seeing the bigger picture.
Right.
Which feels so relevant to how we interact with each other today.
Totally.
We often miss the bigger context.
It's a great metaphor for how limited our perspectives can be.
Yeah, and how much more understanding is possible,
Right.
when we can see the connections between things.
And then he talks about this dream of how it works as like a fundamental human motivation, which is like this deep curiosity to understand how the universe works.
Right.
It's what drives scientific inquiry and philosophical exploration.
Definitely.
And then he contrasts hawks and snakes.
Okay.
The hawk has this broad, overarching view,
Yeah.
and the snake is very patient and grounded.
Hmm.
It's like he's presenting these allegorical perspectives on how to approach life.
What can we take away from those contrasting images?
Well, I think it shows us that there are many different ways to navigate the world.
Okay.
The hawk represents a more strategic approach,
Right.
and the snake embodies patience, observation, being present in the moment.
I see.
It highlights the value in different rhythms and perspectives,
Yes.
Like there's not just one right way to do things.
Right.
And then he touches on time and cycles and this constant movement forward.
And then he uses this really powerful image of a phoenix frozen in a salty shell that can't renew itself.
Wow, that's evocative.
I know it really evokes this feeling of being trapped,
Yeah.
or unable to overcome some kind of limitation.
Yeah, it's this image of potential being stifled.
Yeah.
Like you can't break free and transform.
Right. And he ends his collection of thoughts with the idea that the ultimate meaning is in the living, not in the final outcome.
Hmm.
Which brings us back to his emphasis on process, on being present on the journey itself.
Right.
Okay, so now let's shift gears and delve into Camblin's life and his artistic journey as it's laid out in this biography.
Right.
Yeah.
So the biography really helps us understand a lot of those insightful quotes.
Yeah.
We learn about his early life in Oklahoma, the impact of the Marland estate and the pioneer woman statue.
Oh, yeah.
And it seems like that environment, with its mix of industry and this romanticized view of the past, really shaped his visual language. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And his friendship with Forrest Harrisberger seems like it was super important to him.
Yeah.
They went to the Kansas City Art Institute together. They served in the military together.
Wow.
And it's funny because the biography mentions how he would always be reading paperback novels, even during art class.
Really?
It seems like he was always reading, just constantly taking in ideas and perspectives.
Yeah, his reading list is pretty impressive.
I know.
Emerson, the I Ching haiku.
Yeah.
He was always seeking out new ideas and influences.
For sure. And then, of course, there's that Fulbright scholarship that takes him to Italy.
Right.
And the biography talks about how much the Uffizi Gallery impacted him.
Uh-huh.
And also the Capuchin Catacombs,
Yeah.
which is kind of unexpected.
Yeah.
But it explains why he uses mummy imagery so much in his work.
Huh. That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's this stark contrast, between the vibrancy and beauty of Renaissance art
Yeah.
and then being confronted with death in the catacombs.
Right.
How do you think those experiences might have shaped his art? Well, it's fascinating to think about because it's like these two completely different encounters,
Right.
the celebration of life in Renaissance art,
Yeah.
and then this very direct experience with mortality.
Yeah.
And somehow they both resonated with him really deeply.
Yeah.
Maybe the recurring mummy image represents preservation or the passage of time, or even like this strange connection between life and death.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And the biography specifically mentions Botticelli's The Birth of Venus and Primavera as being big inspirations for him.
Okay.
But it also points out how he would incorporate contemporary elements into his responses, like references to KPFT radio.
Oh, wow.
So he wasn't just copying the old masters, he was making it his own.
Right. It's a classic example of an artist taking inspiration from the past,
Yeah,
reinterpreting it through their own lens.
totally. And, he had this long teaching career at different universities
Right.
before he landed at Rice University in Houston.
Right.
But it seems like he had kind of a complicated relationship with galleries and museums.
Really?
He had some pretty unconventional views on how art should be experienced.
Interesting. So what were some of his critiques?
Well, he really believed that people should fully immerse themselves in the work of one artist at a time.
Okay.
And he thought that those big group exhibitions could be distracting.
Right.
So he wasn't always super keen on showing his work in galleries.
I see.
And then there's this whole period where he collaborates with Earl Staley and Joe Cate,
Yeah.
first as B&E Productions,
Okay.
and then later as the holding firm.
Interesting.
And they did these really experimental shows that really pushed the boundaries.
What was so unique about them?
Well, they were really challenging the traditional ideas of like, who's the artist, and
Right.
what constitutes a work of art.
Mm.
And they even signed their work as anonymous.
Wow. So they were really downplaying the individual ego.
Exactly. They were focusing on the creative process itself, as a collective effort.
That's fascinating.
I know. And the biography also mentions his Scarecrow series, which was inspired by the writings of Günter Grass.
Okay.
And he would do this interesting thing where he would incorporate text into his drawings.
Really?
And the text would serve as both information and disguise, which is so cool.
It
It's
is.
like he was playing with the idea that words can both reveal and obscure meaning.
Yeah, how does that connect with his earlier thoughts on the limitations of language?
Well, I think it's a direct extension of that, you
Yeah.
know? The text in his drawings becomes this other layer that the viewer has to navigate. And it might actually prevent them from understanding the work right away.
Right.
So maybe it forces them to engage with it more intuitively
Yeah.
instead of just relying on like a verbal explanation.
Yeah, like adding another layer of complexity to the experience.
Exactly. And you can see this artistic evolution throughout his career. He starts with social realism, then moves into abstract expressionism.
Okay.
And finally, he develops his Muches Volantes style with Nancy Giordano,
Right.
which is all about using dots and dashes to create these really subtle optical illusions.
Oh, wow.
So it shows that he was always experimenting and pushing his own boundaries.
It really does highlight his constant exploration.
Yeah.
He was never content to just stick with one style.
And this idea that he was constantly trying to submerge his individual ego,
Yeah.
signing his work as anonymous or anonymous artists,
Right.
that was so central to his whole approach to art.
It's a pretty radical idea, really
Yeah.
challenges that traditional emphasis on the individual artistic genius.
Totally. And even his later works like the Big Al series continue that exploration.
Okay.
And the biography talks about how he lived kind of a nomadic life in the 70s and 80s, moving to the Oregon coast and then to Louisiana. And he was kind of out of touch with his friends back in Houston.
Really?
It's like he was so dedicated to his art that he was willing to be isolated.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sad that they tried to organize a retrospective of his work in Houston while he was still alive, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, it really adds to that enigmatic quality about him, Despite all the respect he had from other artists and the depth of his work, he wasn't really widely recognized during his lifetime.
Right.
So now let's focus on his watercolor. What have you done to Mother Nature?
Okay.
We've got these descriptions that really let us dive deep into this piece.
All right. So this watercolor sounds so intricate.
It is.
There's this fractured landscape. You've got barbed wire running through it, these rocky shapes, the suggestion of water, and then like tree stumps.
Okay.
And then there's this whole other layer where he uses pareidolia.
Right.
So there are these hidden images like faces, shapes, even hearts that emerge from the composition.
That's so interesting.
I know. It's like there's this whole story embedded within the artwork.
Right. And what strikes me immediately is that tension between the natural elements, like the rocks and the water, and then the man-made intrusion of the barbed wire.
Right.
It's like this visual representation of how human actions impact nature.
Totally. And that barbed wire really symbolizes restriction, like human control over nature.
Yeah.
Feels very potent, like something is being held back or even wounded.
Definitely. And then you have those hidden images.
Yeah.
Which bring in a whole other dimension.
Right.
It's like he's tapping into the surrealist interest in the unconscious. And it's almost like nature itself is this silent witness to what's happening. And its essence is trapped within the forms of the rocks and the trees.
The sources even compare Camblin to artists like Leonora Carrington, Dorothea Tanning, and Robert Smithson.
Oh, wow.
Which puts him in this broader conversation about landscape and the subconscious and how human actions impact the environment.
Right.
And if you look at it through different philosophical lenses, it gets even more interesting.
Okay.
The painting really aligns with those Zen principles of interconnectedness.
Yeah.
It shows how intertwined our actions are with the fate of nature.
And it also reminds me of the Buddhist concept of dukkha.
Yeah.
Which is the suffering that's inherent in existence.
Right. In this case, it's the suffering that we're inflicting on the earth.
One interpretation even connects the artwork to hexagram 47 kun, oppression, from the I Ching.
Really?
Which symbolizes constraint and the need to persevere.
It's amazing how many layers of meaning there are in this one piece.
It's true. It shows how deep it asks us to look at our own impact and think about what we can do to make things better.
I also love the idea that the painting is like a self-portrait of humanity's relationship with the earth.
Oh, that's interesting.
We shape the environment and it shapes us, right?
Right.
And those hidden faces in the landscape almost invite us to see ourselves within that interplay.
It's like it blurs the lines between observer and observed.
Yeah.
And it challenges us to see our own role in both the problems and the solutions.
Exactly. So what have you done to Mother Nature is both a lament for the state of the environment
Yeah.
and a call to wake up and do something about it.
It really captures a lot of Camblin's key concerns and techniques. You have to look closely to see all the detail. There are these hidden meanings that make you think.
Yeah.
And he's clearly engaging with deep philosophical ideas.
Okay, so to wrap things up,
Mm-hmm.
what would you say is the core of Camblin's artistic philosophy?
Well, I think it boils down to the idea that art is a way to question things,
Yep.
It's a mix of the absurd and the profound. And he used paradoxes and illusions and what he called traps to make people think more deeply.
Yeah, and you can see the influence of Zen Buddhism, the I Ching, and existentialism in his work.
Absolutely.
And I love this idea that he was trying to create everyday enlightenment through his art.
Me too.
He wanted people to see the world differently and embrace the fact that everything is always changing.
Yeah, it shows that he wanted to make art that was more than just something to look at.
Right.
He wanted people to actively engage with it
Yeah.
and have their own personal discoveries.
And his peers and the critics all describe him as this enigmatic and influential figure.
Yeah, they talk about how dedicated he was to his art and how he was always striving for pure expression.
So it sounds like Bob Camblin was a true original.
Definitely.
He was someone who challenged the status quo.
Yeah.
And his work still makes us think and question things today.
Yeah, his legacy lives on.
Well, you came to this deep dive wanting a quick but thorough understanding of Bob Camblin's art, and hopefully you got that.
I hope so.
I think we covered a lot of ground.
Yeah, we did.
And Camblin's work really invites you to keep thinking about it and to come up with your own interpretations.
Absolutely.
There's no one right answer.
Right.
It's all about the journey of discovery. So we encourage you to seek out images of his art, especially what have you done to Mother Nature?
Yeah.
Go and find those hidden faces and meanings for yourself.
It's a great way to really connect with his unique perspective.
Absolutely. And on that note, here's a final thought for you.
Okay.
In this world where we're constantly bombarded with images,
Right.
what does it really mean to truly see, as Bob Camblin urged us to do?
That's a great question.
And how could it romance embracing paradoxes and questioning things that we take for granted?
Yeah.
How could that enrich our understanding of reality? That's something to think about.